Now, because of all these racial categories that you have in New Spain, individuals who are of mixed race, or these castas, would be limited sometimes by how high they could get in society, right? By how high of a rank they could get on the social hierarchy. For example, mestizos. A lot of mestizos couldn't occupy a high position in society because they were considered illegitimate. All right, they were of illegitimate birth, meaning that their parents were not married. And why was this? Because oftentimes the Spaniards would rape indigenous women, and it was through this rape that you would have the offspring of mestizos coming about. Right, so a lot of times there wasn't a marriage between the Spaniard and indigenous woman. And so these children would be considered illegitimate, right? And actually, the term mestizo would sometimes be used in place of the word bastard, right? Meaning illegitimate, like an illegitimate child. And so many of the mestizos didn't have a relationship with their Spanish father. Many of them were raised with their mother, with their indigenous mother, and so they had closer ties to their indigenous side and their indigenous culture, and so they tended to occupy a lower place in society. Now, some mestizos did have relationships with their fathers and may have been raised by their fathers, may have been taught to speak Spanish, and were taught Spanish customs and dressed like a Spaniard. Some of these mestizos may try to pass, we'll talk about passing in just a minute, but some of these mestizos may try to pass for being full-blooded Spaniard or Creole. Okay, so this is where things start to get a little blurry. Okay, where the lines between Creoles and mestizos start to blur a little bit. It kind of depends on your culture. All right, so if you're mestizo, but you have more of an influence from your indigenous culture, you speak your indigenous language, you were raised by your mother, then you would be more related to that side, and you'd be considered a person who was of illegitimate birth, right? If you didn't have a relationship with your Spanish father. But if you were a mestizo who were raised by your father, and you had Spanish culture, then you could maybe pass as being a Creole. Okay, now this is a society of a lot of different mixed race people or castas, right? And sometimes these castas would try to resist the limitations that were put on them by society because of their race. And so there's a number of different ways that they could resist these limitations. One would be by trying to pass for a different racial category. Okay, and so I was giving an example of this earlier when I'm talking about mestizos who may have been a little lighter skinned and knew how to speak Spanish and had relationships with their Spanish father. They may have tried to pass for being Creole, full-blooded Spaniard, right, who was born in the Americas. And this happened sometimes, right? And so you'll have individuals who try to pass, and they may go based on their physical traits, their biology, right? So if they're a little lighter skinned, maybe they could try to pass, maybe they could get away with it, right? Or if they're fully acculturated into Spanish culture, maybe they could get away with passing that way. Okay. Another way that castas could try to resist the limitations, the racial limitations of their society, would be through verbal and physical, sometimes, abuse. All right. So, say for example, they're working for an individual, and that individual, their boss, is trying to, denigrate them because of their race. They could talk back to them, yell at them. Maybe they could even fight them. And this could be a way for them to break the limitations that are put on them because of their race, right? Through actual confrontations, okay, whether they be verbal or physical. Another way that castas may try to resist these limitations was through magic. Okay, maybe they believed in magic and that they could use some type of spirituality, some kind of spiritual technique against the Creoles or the Spaniards, and that would be a way for them to intimidate them, right? And try to resist the limitations put on them because of their race. And then finally, another way that castas could resist their limitations would be through migration. Maybe where they lived, they were put down because of their racial mixture or because of their racial background, but maybe they could migrate to a different region where nobody knows them, and there maybe they could pass for a different racial category and then occupy a higher position in the social hierarchy. Okay, so several different ways that people of mixed race could possibly resist these limitations. Okay, it wasn't always clear, cut, and dry. There are examples of individuals, if you look at the birth records, who would pass for different racial categories. An individual may, in fact, be part indigenous, but their birth certificate may say that they were full-blooded Spanish. And they would try to do this because then they could occupy a better position in society. Because sometimes, people who are of mixed race couldn't get certain occupations. Basically, the lighter your skin is and the more connection that you have to Spanish culture, the higher position that you'll have in the social hierarchy in New Spain. Okay.